between the lungs and the blood. So this diagram just gives you a slightly more detailed idea of that. Here's the partial pressure in the lung. Okay. Has to be higher or lower here for the oxygen to move into the bloodstream.
Higher.
Higher, right? So when we look at the blood flow from the heart to the lungs, the partial pressure at sea level is around 40 millimeters of mercury, right? But when I breathe in, that partial pressure within the lungs is 105. So clearly we have a high load, right? So I can move oxygen out of the lung tissue into the bloodstream, right? And then if we look at the vein coming back to the heart, the partial pressure now is 100. So it goes from 40 to 100, picks up lots and lots of oxygen as it moves through the lungs. Round to the heart, enters the heart, gets squished out of the heart, still 100 because I didn't lose any oxygen in the heart. Remember, the heart has its own external blood supply. It doesn't take things from the blood that's moving through it, right? So when we look at it the other side, we've still got the 100. And then we get down to a tissue. In our case, we're going to look at muscle tissue. Hopefully, we're offloading oxygen at the muscle tissue so that we can create ATP. And so when we look at the blood, the other side of the muscle tissue, we see a decrease in the partial pressure of oxygen. We got rid of a load of oxygen at the muscle tissue. And off we go again. Right? So remember, it's got to be high in the alveoli versus the blood. If I'm offloading oxygen here at the tissue, what does that mean between the blood and the tissue? What level, where's the partial pressure of the oxygen in the muscle tissue compared to the blood?
It's lower.
Lower, right, good. Okay, so I said on Monday, don't get hung up on high load being an area. It's a comparison. Okay. So if I'm going to move oxygen from the lung into the blood, this is high. This is low, and oxygen can move into the bloodstream. When the bloodstream reaches the capillaries and it's wrapped around the muscle tissue, now we want our oxygen to move into the muscle tissue so we can make ATP, okay? Way back at the beginning of the semester. So now the comparison is, this is the same, right? But except now this is considered high and this is considered low. Right? So if this PO2 equals 100 millimeters of mercury, the 100 can be the end product of the low ratio, and now it's going to be higher than we have in the muscle tissue so that we can move out. This comes back when we look at altitude. So this idea is pretty important if you want to work in New Mexico. Because when we look at altitude, we're going to find out why it is aerobic work is hard the higher up we go. And this is key. So if you've got any questions when we're doing review on Friday, make sure that you check back with me. And then, don't forget, here I'm making carbon dioxide as a waste product of aerobic metabolism. So now we're going to go and reverse it, because what we want is to breathe out carbon dioxide. Okay? That's why we don't want to kill our trees. The logging that's going on up north and down in South America, very, very bad, right? Because if we keep breathing out all this carbon dioxide and we don't have enough green stuff to change it back into oxygen for us, sooner or later humans aren't going to exist here because we won't be able to breathe anymore. Okay? So we breathe out carbon dioxide, plants take carbon dioxide in, plants give off oxygen, we breathe in oxygen. It's a nice little circle. Except we're wrecking it. So, it won't be wrecked while we're alive, but somewhere down the line, if we don't stop, we're wrecking it. Okay. All right. So one of the factors we have to pay attention to then is, if I want the most amount of oxygen to saturate my bloodstream when I'm exercising hard, then I would need more blood flow through the lungs to pick up the oxygen that I'm breathing in. And we said when we start exercising, we start to breathe more deeply, and then if necessary, we'll start to breathe more rapidly. So we're doing our best to get air into the lungs. I need to increase blood flow through the lungs to pick up that extra oxygen and get it down to the muscle tissue. So how fast is the blood passing through the lung tissue, through the capillaries in the lungs? When we're at rest, we don't use our whole lung. We only really breathe into the top half of the lung. The bottom half kind of kicks in once we start exercising hard. So when I start to exercise, we said Q goes up. So Q means I've got more blood flow, and I've got more blood flow coming through the capillaries. Now luckily these capillaries are very, very elastic, because that respiratory membrane that we looked at is very delicate. We're only looking at 2-cell thickness. So we don't want a lot of blood pressure in the capillaries around the lungs, because pressure equals damage. So it's very nice that we have high capacitance in the capillaries. They're very stretchy. They can give a lot and absorb this additional blood flow. Okay. So more blood flow means more gas diffusion. And it takes around 1/4 of a second before we get equilibrium. And if we look at the car on the hill, once we've got equilibrium, once the car's on the flat, and take the handbrake off, the car doesn't go anywhere. So once we hit equilibrium, then we've got saturation, and that's as much oxygen as is going across. So we go about 1/4 of a second to get this oxygen into the bloodstream. If my cardiac output goes up so high that I've got so much blood coming through the lung tissue, it may be that I can't pick up all the oxygen in 0.25 of a second. Could be not enough time. So one of the things that happens is we slow down the blood flow because the capillaries are able to expand so much and absorb the extra volume. So we don't see the increase in blood flow that we would expect given the increase in Q. For trained or moderately trained or untrained people, we never really see a problem with this idea. But for people who are highly trained endurance athletes, it's possible that they can get to a point where they really see a decrease in gas exchange because there's so much blood pouring through the lungs so quickly that there's not enough time to offload all the oxygen. So sometimes with really high level endurance athletes, we can see a drop in saturation levels. Not going to see it in the typical population. So I want to be able, in this 0.25, I want to be able to absorb as much oxygen as possible. We start to breathe deeper, so that means I start to utilize some of the alveoli lower down in the lung. That increases the surface area. Bigger surface area means more area for diffusion to occur. So we have lots of mechanisms in place that allow us to get as much oxygen as possible when we start exercising. Right? Remember that if I've got more oxygen in the lung, I've got a steeper gradient, so that's another mechanism that helps us get more oxygen into the bloodstream. Right? So all the dominoes kind of line up when we start to exercise to make sure that we can get that oxygen into the muscle tissue to make ATP. That's what it's all about. Bottom line, we have to make ATP if we want to work that hard for that long. Okay? Now, one of the interesting things always surprises me when I look at this chapter is when we look at adaptation, we say adaptation is typically positive and something's going to happen that makes us better at doing that job. So it would make a lot of sense if I do a lot of aerobic training that we saw an increase in the capillary network that wraps around the alveoli. Just like we do in skeletal muscle tissue in aerobic athletes, they have more capillary network around their muscle tissue than an anaerobic athlete or a sedentary person. It would make sense if we saw a similar adaptation here, and it's one of the instances where that doesn't happen. So if I do a lot of aerobic training, does not mean I increase the capillary network around the alveoli. So if we go back here, then I'm assuming in my head that piece of information says to me that genetically I've already got as much capillary network just normally to do any job I need done. But it always surprises me because I would expect there to be a change in that capillary network. Okay, so we've looked at respiration, we've got the oxygen into our lungs, we've got the oxygen out of the lungs and into the bloodstream. So now I have to catch it and transport it. In the bloodstream, we have a lot of water, a lot of plasma, and that is not very efficient at collecting the oxygen. We don't see very much oxygen dissolved in the plasma. The majority of the oxygen gets picked up on the hemoglobin that we mentioned a couple of classes ago. Right? So our red blood cell count is important. If you have any blood work done, they're always looking at red blood cell count. If your oxygen stats are down, then it could be because your hemoglobin, your red blood cells are down, or they're not working properly because you're not well. Right? 98% then of the oxygen that comes across the membrane gets picked up by hemoglobin. And you might see the terms oxyhemoglobin, that means the hemoglobin has oxygen on it, or deoxyhemoglobin, the hemoglobin doesn't have any oxygen. Right? Hemoglobin's just the bus. So, how much hemoglobin I have, how many buses I have running the route, impacts how much oxygen I can transport around the body. Iron sits in hemoglobin, and iron is responsible for hemoglobin being able to do its job properly and pick up the oxygen. So when we look at iron deficiency, anemia, then anemia can be either your red blood cell count is low, or you got loads of red blood cells, but the hemoglobin content is low for some reason. Either way, low hemoglobin or hemoglobin that can't do its job because it hasn't got enough iron means that I can't transport as much oxygen as I should be able to. Usually, anemia is due to iron deficiency. So that's the primary cause for anemia. That can be either I'm not eating foodstuffs that have iron in them, or for some people they eat plenty of food that has iron in it, but they have an absorption problem within the stomach and the digestive tract. So they're taking in the iron, but for some reason it isn't moving across into the body. Okay. So iron deficiency could be either or. Hemorrhaging can be a cause for anemia. So if people are in accidents and things, then that can be a problem. Heavy menstrual cycles is like hemorrhaging. Guys, trust us. When we say it hurts, it's not good, right? So that's like hemorrhaging. So more women suffer from anemia than men do. Okay? Particularly then, if you're in an area of the world where iron isn't a typical part of the diet, because then you've got a double whammy. Right? Pregnancy can cause anemia because a lot of your blood and your red blood cells and the oxygen are going to the baby. And so you may be technically anemic. Being anemic then severely impacts aerobic work. Your capacity to work aerobically drops off enormously if you're diagnosed with anemia. So if you've got athletes who have very heavy menstrual cycles, they might see a decrease in performance for a couple of days during their cycle. Some doctors say take iron. I always think it's better to try to increase your iron through diet rather than anything. First course of action, try to increase it in your normal diet before you resort to taking a tablet. because nothing works quite as well from a tablet as it does in real food. So we want to be as saturated as possible. The goal is to get all the hemoglobin carrying oxygen if I'm doing high-level aerobic work. Right? We want to be 100% saturated. Alright, so I've got it onto the hemoglobin and it's flowing around the body and we get to a muscle and now I have to get it off again. Right? We've got to unload the bus at the right point. So what's the mechanism that helps us load and unload the bus at the correct point in the body? Because there's no point in offloading a load of oxygen to my arm if I'm squatting. I would need to offload the oxygen to my quads. Right? So there has to be a mechanism there to make sure that we deliver the oxygen to the correct working muscle tissue. Right? Can I absorb it? Can I release it at the right bus stop? The oxy-dissociation curve is horrible. Some semesters I look at it and I go, oh yeah, I can do that. That's pretty cool. And other semesters I look at it and I'm like, I thought I understood this and it's quite confusing now. So luckily, because we're PE people, we don't have to know the ins and outs and all the technical stuff of the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. I hate that name, right? Because it can be quite complicated. But what we want to get from this picture, what we have to understand about the curve, because it will turn up when you're reading things, is that the curve represents the ability for the body to offload this oxygen. Right, so here's my partial pressure. And here's my percentage saturation. Right. At 100% saturation, I can offload a lot of oxygen to the tissue. When we see, like here, I'm getting rid of lots of oxygen, right? And my partial pressure is dropping down. And here is blood now coming out the other side with very little oxygen. And here's blood in the arteries with lots and lots of oxygen. When I exercise, there's a way of shifting this curve. So if you read graphs very well, the curve shifts to the right if I increase the temperature. Increasing the temperature makes it easier for hemoglobin to let go of its oxygen. So what I see on the curve is the curve comes this way. If you're not good at reading graphs, don't worry. You just need to know that temperature increases the capability of offloading the oxygen. If we increase acidity, the curve shifts to the right. So when I increase acidity, it enables hemoglobin to release its oxygen more easily. When I exercise, the muscle tissue and the bloodstream temperature goes up. I'm breaking down foodstuffs, only about 60% or so of the energy gets used for ATP, the rest of it gets released as heat. When you exercise, you get hot. So we increase temperature when we exercise. That moves the curve to the right. and it enables the oxygen to jump off the bus more easily. When I exercise, we see increases in acidity in the muscle cell. We talked about, we see increases in hydrogen ions, we see increases in lactic acid, and then we see increases in lactate as it shifts out into the bloodstream. So pH changes, which also helps me offload oxygen. So if we go back to our squatting idea, right, that means temperature and pH is changing much more in my quads than it is in my arms, which is a mechanism whereby I offload oxygen into my quads rather than offloading it into a muscle that's not doing very much. So when you're looking at this curve, you want to look at the big picture, not the tiny little details, all right? Because it does get pretty complicated. What I want to know is, how do we increase the ability to get the oxygen off, right? How do I cut the hemoglobin kind of tie to the oxygen? The active muscle tissue, we see increases in temperature, increases in pH, and that leads to increased oxygen delivery. So that's just a complicated version of this. Again, right? Me, I like simple. I like simple. There's too much stuff. It's like going into Walmart and there's 15 types of baked beans on the shelf. I can't do it. I just need really plain, simple, right? But it's saying the same thing. Okay? Here's my carbon dioxide in my tissue. Hemoglobin, carbon dioxide does dissolve in plasma, but hemoglobin also can pick some carbon dioxide up. Here's my oxygen, and I'm going to move my oxygen off the red blood cell and into the tissue. All right. So carbon dioxide coming the other way can get dissolved into the plasma, somewhere around 10%, 12%. Only about 20% jumps onto the hemoglobin. And the rest of it is changed into bicarbonate, transported as bicarbonate, which releases a hydrogen, so it increases acidity, so it helps get the oxygen off. So all, again, the pieces of the pie fit together, but they get a bit complicated sometimes. So the carbon dioxide, if it becomes bicarbonate, releases a hydrogen, which increases acidity, which means the next red blood cell coming through can get rid of its oxygen even more easily, because acidity went up. Carbon dioxide is transported back to the lungs, either on hemoglobin as bicarbonate or a little bit dissolved in the plasma. We get back to the lungs and it can move out off the bloodstream into the lungs and we breathe it out. Which is great because we can't use it. It's not a molecule we can use to do anything, so we need to be able to get rid of it. So, partial pressure differences between oxygen and carbon dioxide at the lung and the blood and the tissue, because we need to be able to move them not just in and out of the lung, but in and out of the muscle. So here's my diagram again. Here's my 100. I'm still at 100. I get to the muscle, the diffusion gradient, right? The pressure in the muscle is only 40, so I have a diffusion gradient then of 60 millimeters of mercury. Big steep gradient, take the handbrake off, car runs down a hill very fast. Makes it very easy to get oxygen into the muscle tissue. And when we look at altitude, that's where our problems start occurring. In the muscle, we have another molecule that's quite similar to hemoglobin. It's not exactly the same, but it's very similar, and it is helpful for transporting the oxygen. Where do I use the oxygen in the muscle cell? Where do I make the most amount of ATP in the muscle cell? Where does system 3 occur?
The mitochondria.
Thank you. All right. So I've still got to get the oxygen from the muscle membrane over to the mitochondria. And that's where myoglobin comes in. It's like a secondary bus system, picks oxygen up, moves it across to the mitochondria. Remember, if we're aerobically trained, I have more mitochondria, so the diffusion distance becomes shorter, and so I'm able to make ATP more efficiently. Do we want to do control? Let's see. Oh, okay. When you look at ventilation, most of the mechanisms that are involved in ventilation are subconscious, right? You're not aware of chemoreceptors, pressure receptors, right? The respiratory center in the medulla in the brain gets sent messages from all these chemoreceptors. If my acidity is going up, I need more oxygen. So the chemoreceptors recognize the increase in acidity. They send a message to the respiratory center, and we change our breathing pattern. Typically, it changes without us thinking about it. The interesting thing about breathing is I can override the respiratory center for a little while. So if I choose to, I can hold my breath. If I hold my breath, I'm not breathing out carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide levels are going up in the bloodstream. That carbon dioxide is held as bicarbonate, which releases hydrogen, so acidity is going up. Sooner or later, you will breathe. That's why people drown. Okay? Because you might be able to hold your breath, give or take, for a couple of minutes. I can't, but some people can. But sooner or later, you will breathe. And if you're under the water, you're in trouble. Right? So you can override the respiratory center for a portion of time. 2-year-olds, terrible twos, right? Big tantrums, do it all the time. Hold their breath, And they hold their breath, and they hold their breath, and they start going red in the face, and mum is panicking because they won't breathe. Most of the time, you can just go, you hold your breath, I've got other things to do, because they will breathe. Even if they pass out, they'll breathe, right? Because the brain won't allow you to hold your breath for very long. It kicks back in, and you can't voluntarily override that anymore. One of the things that swimmers do, they try to use this mechanism to their advantage. If you watch really good top-class swimmers, before they dive in, before the gun goes off, they'll be on the block going, right? And then they'll dive. Well, it's easy to think, oh, they're breathing in, they're trying to get in as much oxygen as possible, because when I dive at the beginning of a swimming race, aerodynamically, I am faster under the water than on top of the water. So when I dive, I want to stay under the water for as long as possible down the length of the pool before I have to surface. So it's really easy to go, oh, they're breathing in loads of oxygen so they can stay under the water. But that's not what they're doing. What they're doing is blowing off lots of carbon dioxide, because if I blow off the carbon dioxide, I lower the acidity in the bloodstream, and I can trick the brain into thinking it doesn't need to breathe. And so they can hold their breath for a little bit longer. Well, swimming races are a bit like 100-meter, 200-meter sprints. They are won by teeny, teeny, teeny margins, right? So a little bit of advantage coming up out of the dive could be the race. So it's very cool, right? We can trick the brain. What happens? Anybody ever seen anyone hyperventilate? Anybody hyperventilated? Not nice. So if you have one of the things you always want to carry in your gym bag, or in your, make sure you've got it in your PE room, or a brown paper bag. Always have a brown paper bag. Because when we hyperventilate, we take in too much oxygen, and we blow off lots of carbon dioxide because we go because I'm nervous, right? Some people hyperventilate when they're nervous, because we always tell people, breathe deeply, right? So we breathe deeply, except then we tend to blow out deeply as well. And when we blow out, we trick the brain, and then you get to the point where you can't breathe, right? So actually what happens when someone hyperventilates, they blow off so much carbon dioxide, the brain won't let them breathe. And it's literally like your respiratory muscles just won't work. Like you can't breathe. The way to get around that, if you see that happen, if you don't have a brown paper bag, you can put your hands over someone's face. But what you need is for them to breathe in carbon dioxide to increase the acidity to make the brain start breathing again. Cool. Yeah?
What happens when a kid, like, or somebody gets an air knocked out of them and they can't breathe?
I think that, it's a good question. I don't know the exact answer. I think that some of that is the shock to the muscles, but you breathe out a lot of carbon dioxide when you do that, because you, like, if you hit, it doesn't have to be if someone hit. If you fall out of a tree and hit the ground, you would push more carbon dioxide, and then for a minute your brain is going to stop you breathing. But I think it's probably a combination of breathing out that extra carbon dioxide that you didn't mean to, plus the muscle, so you hit the muscle really hard, it's like stretching it, and then you've got a muscle contraction. And so now you can't. That would be my guess. Not comfortable. Scary, right? Usually getting the wind knocked out of you is more scary than anything else, especially for kids. But yeah, it's a very interesting mechanism when you look at, as I say, hyperventilation. Always carry a brown paper. You can't use a plastic bag. Hands are okay, but brown paper bag works better. Just get them to breathe in and out of a brown paper bag, and all the symptoms will ease off. If you can recognize it, you can deal with it quite easily. Sometimes people who hyperventilate end up in the hospital because the people around them don't know what's happening and they can't breathe. And so they call an ambulance, and all you needed to do was stick a bag over their face. Okay. Changes in ventilation. So here's my ventilation at rest. We said when we start exercising, we start to breathe more deeply. Okay. So we start to breathe more deeply. We'll get to a plateau if we plateau our intensity of workload. So it's like a steady state that we see in energy production. My breathing rate will plateau at the point where I am getting enough oxygen into the system to deal with the workload. And then I'm going to stop exercising. Remember, we keep breathing. What's that called? What does that look like, that curve? Epoch, good, right? So we keep breathing when we finish exercising because we've got to replace the oxygen, we've got to decrease the temperature, we've got all that stuff going on to get us back to homeostasis before we get back to resting breathing levels. Typically, ventilation breathing would not be a limitation for most people, right? If I've got asthma, different kettle of fish. But normally, my ability to breathe is not a limiting factor. My ability to transfer oxygen from the breathing into the bloodstream can be a limiting factor. But the actual breathing mechanism generally is not a problem. Respiratory muscles, we said the heart beats all the time. Therefore, it's aerobic. Respiratory muscles, when do you stop breathing? Hopefully, not for very many years. Guys, you are hard work today. Geez, it's Wednesday. What are you going to be like on Friday? Hell's bells. Right? So my respiratory muscles are also highly oxidative. They're not exactly a type 1 skeletal fiber, but they work very similar. They are very capable at using oxygen to make ATP so that they can keep working for a long time. They're relatively fatigue resistant, but there is some literature to suggest that they're trainable. And there are these masks out now that call themselves altitude masks, but I'm trying to do some research on those because I'm pretty sure that's not true. Right? I don't think they have anything to do with altitude training. The only thing I'm reading is that they would increase your they would train your respiratory muscles because they increase the pressure that you're having to breathe against, and so they make you contract harder. I haven't read anything yet that says they have anything to do with altitude. So I'm working on it because when we get to altitude, I wanted to be able to. Last year, some people asked me some questions and I was like, so I'm trying to find that out. But there is some research to suggest that within limits, those respiratory muscles, so particularly the ones that run around your rib cage, can be trained to be a little bit stronger so that you can breathe more deeply. But I haven't read anything that suggests it's like being fast and slow. I can't change something completely. I can only improve it a little bit. Okay? Revision on Friday. Make sure that if you've got questions as you're looking, use your website for the textbook. They have very good study strategies up there, great tools to help you look at the key points.